Hey guys, I wanted to let you know that the audio is a bit messed up in this video. I think my daughter played with the levels before recording. The thing is, I think the content is still really good. And I know if I recorded it again, I don't think I would be as thorough or as engaged in what I was talking about. So you're just gonna have to grin it and bear it for this one. It's really good content and the audio will be fixed for next time. Thanks. Today we're gonna talk about 5 tips for Genshin Impact combat that if you implement will instantly get you faster, more comfortable clear times, and potentially taking you from not being able to fully clear the abyss to getting your full 36 stars. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Obviously, you might already be implementing these 5 tips. Maybe they'll be a good reminder for you. But if not, and you already know all of these, I would love to hear in the comments your best tips so that anyone who's looking to further level up their Genshin game can check out the experienced viewers' tips in the comments. But let's start off with number 1, not having enough energy recharge. There is a ton of Genshin Impact characters that do the majority of their damage through their elemental burst. And when we're talking about improving damage, a really good artifact set might give a character 10 or 15% more damage. An incredible constellation might give 20, 30, 40% more damage. Imagine if you miss a rotation and you don't have enough ER and you potentially wait Yelan's whole skill cooldown of 10 seconds and you have to use it again to charge up your ER. Your rotation is only 20 seconds. So by losing that amount of ER, you lose 50% of your damage right there, if not more, because 10 seconds is half of 20 seconds, which is your rotation length. And this further compounds if you have multiple characters without enough ER. People get so tunnel visioned on making some great crit stats that they do something like this and they only have 20% ER. Way better just to swap out maybe your sands from an HP to an energy recharge sands. Now all of a sudden, sure, maybe my ER sands isn't as good. You should obviously also be using a crit rate mask. There, my crit ratio doesn't have as high a crit damage, but the energy recharge makes it more consistent. I actually get my burst when I need it. How much ER do you need? Enough to use your important bursts off cooldown. So her duration of her burst is 15 seconds. She uses her skill every 10 seconds. You're probably going to only be able to get 1 skill per burst. So every 15 to 20 seconds, you're going to want your burst ready. Don't be shy about giving your units Favonius weapons. Don't be shy about giving them ER sands. I'd rather you build too much ER than not enough. But there's another way that you can improve your play and reduce your energy recharge needs, and that's by having proper rotations, which we'll talk about next. There's a lot of things that go into constructing and using a team rotation properly, and we're not going to be able to cover everything in this video. But there are some basic rules. Number 1, you generally want to use the skills and bursts that last the longest first. So Raiden's skill lasts a super long time, so I almost always want to lead off with her skill. The next thing for this team anyways is that Furina's skill and burst last a super long time as well, so I'm going to use those next. Then I want to use Yelan's skill and burst because it lasts shorter than those. And then I want to use Kazuha's swirl because not only does it not last as long, but I want to maximize the buffing time that he gives to my character. We'll talk more about swirl a little bit later, but that's the first step in constructing a rotation, is you want to consider which characters' skills and bursts last the longest and use them in the right order that matches up with that. Funneling is when you intentionally create energy particles using your character's skills that fill up the character's burst without taking extra time. The most common way of doing that is to always start with a character's skill because that's what will create the particles, and then use their elemental burst. So I want to use Yelan's skill, it creates particles, and then I use her burst, just like you saw me do. Kazuha's skill into his burst, so then I don't waste the animation. If I use his burst first, then use his skill, then I have to wait to catch his particles before I swap to the next character, wasting time. Or if I use Kazuha's skill first, create particles, then swap to Raiden, then I'll waste particles because she'll be catching animal particles rather than electro particles, which he wants. And Kazuha wants to catch the animal particles, so he wants to skill first, then burst, so he can catch his own skill's particles. Usually the same with Yelan. Her skill does more damage if she's already used her burst first, so there might be some circumstances where you'd want to use her skill first, or you'd want to use her burst before her skill. And so that's the most common type of funneling, is to funnel into your own character. It's called pre-funneling. So you use the skill first to create the particles, then into the character's burst. There's not only pre-funneling though, there's also funneling from other characters. Funneling is done when you have a really high energy cost unit, such as Xiangling, and you have a unit that's generally considered their battery, such as Bennett. So during the downtime of the rotation, when your other characters are not doing anything, or just if you have to, you funnel by using one character's skill, switching to the character that needs to catch the particles, and there they've now picked up the particles. But there's also funneling, such as instead of I could pre-funnel Bennett by using his skill first, and then using his burst. But instead, I'm going to pre-funnel Xiangling by dropping Bennett's burst, then using his skill, then using Xiangling's burst before the particles quite get to her, and that way I pre-funneled Xiangling. What this means is I won't have to build as much energy recharge on Xiangling, because even with an energy recharge sands, an energy recharge weapon, sometimes for really high burst cost characters, it can be hard to charge them up even when using lots of ER. You have to make sure you're pre-funneling into them with another character. Obviously, using Favonius weapons is going to help, because Favonius weapons create white particles, and so you can pre-funnel that way too. But these are things that you want to consider when you're constructing your rotation. The other thing, of course, is basic stuff like making sure Bennett's burst is down before you're using Xiangling's burst, because she's going to want to snapshot it, etc, etc. Some other characters you might have to funnel are characters like Ito. You're going to want to use Goro's skill and then switch into Ito so that he can catch those particles. Characters like Zhao, if you're playing, for example, Sucrose on a Zhao team, you'll want to use Sucrose and then switch into Zhao to funnel him. And characters like Ayaka or characters like Eula, who also you want to use other cryo characters and then switch into them so they can catch the particles. Before we leave rotations, I want to talk about another mistake I see people make, is that they'll have a character that procs damage off of normal attacks, such as Xing Cho, and so you'll use your skill and burst, and then you switch to Bennett, you're doing your skill and Xiangling burst, but you're not doing any normal attacks in between as you're switching around. Because if you don't, you're losing out on Xing Cho's Rain Sword damage during the rotation. So even after you set him up, you're going to want to be doing maybe Bennett normal attack into skill and then switch to Xiangling. That you're going to want to weave in as many normal attacks as you can so that you don't miss out on all that damage. That's the end of number 2, rotations. Again, rotations is such a big topic. There's no possible way for me to cover everything on it. I highly recommend watching abyss clears of the teams that you play to get an idea of that specific team's rotation, or at least even similar teams. The next thing is when we're actually in combat is understanding enemy AI attack patterns. So for example, knowing that these little abyss mages, they like to teleport to where you are. So if there's multiple abyss mages like there were in the last abyss, moving over towards the corner can bring them closer to you. This one, I guess, maybe because he's standing beside the Samatril, doesn't want to teleport to me. But in general, oh, there we go. In general, that's what they're going to be doing. So oftentimes there's a certain corner of the abyss that you'll want to move towards that's better than other corners. And if you oftentimes you can run back, you can run towards a corner, and it's called edge baiting. Here, he's coming here now. So by edge baiting, I don't have to run after him. He can run after me, and especially when there's multiple enemies and I want to group them together, edge baiting can be a very, very effective tactic. Not all enemies will allow you to do this though. This guy just likes to stand still and use range attack. So since they spawn right there, it's not the best idea. But maybe these guys, I can edge bait them by moving back here. Here we go. So we've got all 3 of these enemies coming up close. And so even if I don't have a grouper, I can potentially attack them all while we're in this corner. I talk about edge baiting in particular because it's almost always a good idea regardless of what enemies you're fighting against. Even if you're fighting against something like the Abyss Lecter, the Fathomless Flames, these Pyro Lecters is one of the best examples as well, because when they spawn, if you go all the way to the left of the Abyss, then they start out kind of far away from each other, but if you go all the way to the left, the further one moves closer to the other one, and then you're able to group them much easier. Or you can do what Eula has done, and then after they clear the first wave, they go to the back, they get both of them to walk towards them, and then you run over, like I said, to the corner. Either the right or the left would work here, and the furthest one comes closer to the other one, so now they're beside each other. Now you can hit them both at the same time. This is going to essentially put your clear time in half, because if they're spread apart, there's nothing you can do, right? You have to kill bait them one at a time, basically. But if you can manipulate the AI, even if it takes you a few seconds to do so, once you can get them close together, now it takes not even close to as much time. Each enemy has little tricky things like that, and just watching Abyss clears is honestly the best way to get an idea of the best strategies to do. There's a bajillion Abyss clears every time the new Abyss resets. You can find the team that you're using and see what people are doing to do that. I like to figure things out by myself. I like to not necessarily play crazy optimally so I don't end up doing this. But if you're trying to clear the Abyss, if you're trying to get those 36 stars, looking up other people's clears and how they're doing things is key. Subscribe to Surula, they do some of the best clears. I don't think there's too much of a point of going through every single enemy and talking about each one of their AIs, because everyone has different tricks and different tips and different ways that you can manipulate their AI, or different big attacks that you have to make sure you dodge. So just really looking up those Abyss clears with your teams versus that Abyss is the best way, and over time you'll get an idea of how Genshin constructs their AIs, and you'll be able to figure it out for yourself in the future. Tip number 4, using Swirl properly. So first of all, one of the main reasons why you use Swirl at all is to take advantage of the Viridescent Venerer artifact buff, which reduces the elemental resistance to the element infused in the swirl by 40% for 10 seconds. So first of all, 40% defense reduction, or resistance reduction, sorry, is a lot. So it's very important that we get this buff properly. Nice. And second of all, it only lasts 10 seconds. So that's not a very long time. Your rotations usually last 20 seconds, give or take. So only lasting 10 means that if you use it while you're still setting up the rotation, it takes 5 seconds maybe to set up. So if you swirl at the beginning, you might have only 5 seconds of swirl left to let your DPS do damage, and you're going to lose a lot of damage that way. So you want to generally swirl right before the majority of the team damage is happening. Obviously Sucrose in this team, I'm using her on field, so I don't have to worry about that. But if we go back to my Raiden, Farina, Yelan team, which this is an overworld team by the way, normally I wouldn't put Kazuha in this team. If I'm using this team, I want to swirl with Jean right before I start attacking with Raiden, because if I swirl in the beginning, all of the damage is going to be gone. But this is pretty well understood. I think where people often mess up is when doing double swirl. Double swirl is actually easier or harder depending on what elements you're actually trying to swirl. With that first team I showed with Yelan and Raiden and Farina, Electro and Hydro can both coexist on the enemy together. So they're very easy to double swirl. It really almost doesn't matter what you do. You can't mess up an Electro Hydro double swirl. A Hydro Pyro double swirl, however, is much more common and much more difficult to do. Once you get the hang of it, it's not that difficult, but in the beginning it can be more difficult. Just gonna make sure all my bursts are charged up here. So we'll start right here where the enemy has no elements applied to them. You can see up at the top where their health bar is, you can see they have no elements applied. To start my double swirl, I want to first apply Hydro, then apply Pyro, then I'm going to swirl both of them. And to check if I've done this correctly, I'm going to use Kazuha, and I'm going to check his Pyro and Hydro damage buff. So I can see he's given a Pyro damage bonus and a Hydro damage bonus. He's standing in Bennett's circle, and I have C6 Bennett, so he has actually a 15% Pyro damage bonus from Bennett. So if we take out that 15%, we're left with a 34% Pyro damage and a 34% Hydro damage bonus, which means I got the double swirl. The confusing part though, you didn't see Hydro on the enemy, or you didn't see Pyro on the enemy after I used Bennett's burst. So without this, it's hard to tell if I really got it. But it's very important that I do, because both Yelan and Yoimiya contribute a ton of damage to this team, and by missing that double swirl, I lose a ton of damage. So let's charge up everyone's bursts again. Yeah, everyone's good. Okay. And it's very easy to miss. So let's say I start with Hydro, then I try and pre-funnel with Bennett, and then I swirl with Kazuha. Now I missed my Pyro swirl, or I missed my Hydro swirl. So in this instance, pre-funneling with Bennett, not such a good idea, because I'm going to apply too much Pyro and remove the Hydra from the enemy, so I didn't get my double swirl. I'm going to miss a lot of damage if I do this. So this is something that you might actually want to practice. This is one of those a bit more noodly points of Genshin where you actually want to practice and understand what's going on with kind of the deeper mechanics of the game. There's also certain elements in the game that you really can't double swirl very well. It's very hard to swirl Pyro and Cryo, for example. They basically can't coexist on the enemies at the same time. One way that you can always get a double swirl is by applying some elements to one character, to one enemy and some elements to another enemy, and then swirling them together kind of mixes them all around. That's a way that you can reliably get a double swirl, but it doesn't work in single target, of course. Another tricky one is freeze when you've got cryo and hydro applied to the enemy. Now, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments because I only have so far used Kazuha with freeze. I recently got Venti and I haven't used Sucrose with freeze until Farina came around. So with Kazuha, what you can do is you can use his hold E instead of his tap E, so the strong E where you hold it for longer. And for whatever reason, the stronger swirl, it clears some of the hydro off the enemy, I guess revealing some of the cryo for lack of a better term. And you're gonna get a double swirl of hydro and cryo. And if you just do that right before you send in your Ayaka for her burst, you're gonna make sure that you have that cryo swirl on your Ayaka. But I'm not sure how to guarantee a double swirl for Sucrose and a double swirl for Venti, so I'm going to look out in the comments for you guys. I did do some research, couldn't quite find what I was looking for, and I'll make a pinned comment for what I find out. But that is my big tip for double swirling freeze with Kazuha. Keep in mind when you're swirling for Dendro teams, strong Dendro like Nahida can make it difficult to swirl Electro, which means you might need to swirl Electro before applying the Dendro if you're using Nahida, or just make sure that you have strong Electro aura going on. Even if you have Dendro, sometimes it can work. It's just something you want to keep in mind, that you actually see Electro on the enemy when you're swirling. And now let's move on to tip number 5, which is doing your own team building. Of course, there are quote-unquote best teams or premium teams for most units in the game. But you don't want to be so locked into those teams that you just choose them no matter what. You want to choose your teams based on the enemies that are in the Abyss. So for example, it doesn't matter to me if Hyper Carry Raiden is the best Raiden team. If I want to use, assuming I don't want to use Hyper Bloom Raiden, which I don't want to talk about right now. But assuming I want to use Carry Raiden, of course, most people would agree that Raiden C6 Kujosara is going to be her best team, or Raiden Fischl as a substitute, or Raiden Yaimiko if you're a cultured individual like me. I would never think to bring Raiden Yaimiko or Raiden Sara to the first half of this Abyss. If I'm doing the first half of this Abyss, I'm bringing Hydro. And I think a lot of people get so tunnel visioned into bringing their specific best team for that character that they forget about other options that could synergize with that character for that particular Abyss. So I'm going to be using Raiden, and I'll use, maybe I'll use Yelan Bennett Kazuha, but maybe instead I'll use Yelan Xingqiu Jean or Yelan Farina Jean ideally, because Hydro is so important for that first half. And if for some reason you look at this Abyss and you want to use Ayaka on the second side, I don't know why you wouldn't use Ayaka on the first side. But maybe the first side, maybe this is a different Abyss and the Ayaka doesn't work on the first side because there's a cryo shield or something like that. Don't be afraid to not do Ayaka in a freeze team, for example. Don't be afraid to do a mono cryo team or use Bennett as a support for Ayaka. If there's a cryo shield and you want to bring Bennett Kazuha to help break that cryo shield and just use Ayaka for the damage. Like, most people don't have every single character in the game. I saw someone comment to me that I stopped watching the video after you said that you use Xingqiu on a Nilou team, and I find that hilarious because one of the best ways to show, or like this Abyss, we're lucky. Every single, the first half is totally AoE, so Nilou just destroys the first half. But sometimes there's a boss chamber in here. It's mostly AoE with a boss chamber. Or maybe you do want to boss rush the second side with Nilou for some reason. Well, just because Xingqiu doesn't have amazing synergy with Nilou doesn't mean he doesn't have synergy at all. He can easily shore up Nilou's single target weakness, and Nilou can easily shore up Xingqiu's AoE weakness, and you can absolutely use them together. So all I'm saying is don't forget to switch up your teams and not just use the best team for a character. Don't be afraid to put an Electro character with Hu Tao for the second side. Because we have the algorithm of semi-intrinsic matrix of Overseer Network on the second side, you might want to bring Fischl along with your Hu Tao. Even though you have double Hydro Zhongli, you might want to do single Hydro with Fischl. And yeah, you're not going to get as many vapes, but if your Hu Tao is well invested, you're going to be fine, etc. Teams don't have to be optimal to clear. Sometimes the optimal team is utilizing what you have to give you the best matchup versus the enemy. Those are my top 5 tips. Let me know what your top 5 tips would be. But obviously I can't talk about everything with team building. So if you want to hear my full thoughts on how to team build properly, watch this video here, Make Bad Units Good. It's not just about building with bad units, it's about building teams. That video will be linked right here. I may actually change the thumbnail, so it might have Hu Tao on it. Just talk about an ultimate team building guide video. So watch that video if you're interested, and bye for now.